Are you optimistic of what's going to happen?
I do not believe Israel will exist as it does for longer than 15, 20 years.
What is the story behind the October 7 attacks?
Europeans and the Brits were so strongly anti-Semitic.
Are they looking to integrate Palestinians into their own societies?
Greater Zionism believes that the promised land is from the River Nile to the Euphrates.
Welcome to the Late Night Podcast by Q+. Tonight's episode is special. It's about Palestine. We're going to talk about what's happening in Palestine right now and what's the future of this conflict. That's why joining us today is Jamal ElShayyal. Jamal, if you could take it from here and give me a little background to me and the audience listening and watching us.
Firstly, thank you very much for having me here, albeit obviously on, as you mentioned, a very somber topic, one that has been very difficult for everybody, but even us as journalists, despite all the things that we see in our lives and we report on, the past month and a half have been a very difficult time for people to witness the images that have been coming out of Gaza and Palestine at large for what's going on. And as you mentioned there, this is something that has been going on for, the conflict over that land, or the struggle for liberation in that land, has been something that is going on for decades. But what we have witnessed now is something unheard of before. It's been unheard of for a number of different reasons, both in terms of the killing and the sheer amount of it and the ferocity of it, and both in terms of the way in which it is being heard and consumed by the public. And on top of that, the narratives and the shift in politics and so forth. We'll come to the first and third point after, but the one thing that's very strange, and it's making it very difficult for people even to comprehend, is that this is the first time you're seeing a genocide being live streamed. Right?
Jamal, let me stop you right here. What is the story behind the October 7 attacks?
So it depends whether people want to get into the story or to get into a story, right? And what I mean by that is that everything has a beginning, middle, and end. Some people, when they come to watch something, they just want to watch the clip of it, right? Or they want to catch the middle and just move forward, right? Which is fair enough in certain respects. But if you really want to understand something, you have to go to the beginning. And where is the beginning? The beginning isn't October 7th. The beginning isn't October 1st. It's not January 1st. It's not 2020. The beginning actually is not even 1948. It's before that, where you have a people who are living on a land called Palestine, that was at the time under what they called British Protectorate, administered by the British Empire. And the people of Britain, or not the people, the government of Britain, at the time specifically somebody called Lord Balfour, promised a land of a people to a different people, quite simply. So the British went, or the Zionist Federation at the time and lobbyists, went to the Brits and they said, we would like a land. Give us part of the land that, all of this, you're occupying half of the world anyway. The British Empire was very big at the time, and obviously the empires in the East were crumbling, so both the Ottoman Empire as well as the Prussia and that area. So the Brits at the time decided to say, well, you know what, we will give you this land. The irony in this, well, there are many ironies and many sad things, but one of the sad things that people don't realize is that actually the reason why the Brits and the Europeans at large were so much in favor of giving a piece of land to the, at the time, Jewish community, but I say Jewish because they were identified at the time, but not all of the Jews. You had the Zionist movement at the time, was because the Europeans and the Brits were so strongly anti-Semitic. They hated the Jews.
They had some history with them.
A lot. There was the pogroms in Europe. There was obviously afterwards the Holocaust. If you look at British history, for example, you had universities in the United Kingdom that up until like the early 1900s would not allow for Jews to enter, right? There was a lot of that. So they gave that land not because they loved the Jews, because they wanted to get rid of them. It was an actual anti-Semitic intention by the Brits and the Europeans to find the land. A consequence of which was that you gave this land that belonged to one people to a second people.
And I heard they offered like several countries.
Yes, so the Zionist ideas at the time, as led by Theodor Herzl and others through it, identified 3 different countries where they thought a possible Jewish state could be built. Uganda, Uruguay, I believe, was the second, and
Argentina.
Argentina rather, and Palestine is the third. They settled on Palestine because the argument that could be drawn around it was seen to be one that was more convincing, despite the fact, again, that you have the actually practicing Jews view that as something that goes against their own religion, based on the fact that their religious teachings prevent them from returning to or establishing a state until much
End
later.
of time, they
Yes.
see it, yeah.
So this is the essence of it. So what we're saying, what we see now, this is the essence, the beginning of the story. So the questions you'll ask, okay, or our listeners will ask and say, well, okay, they took the land in 1948. Well, white Europeans went and took America, for example, much before and got rid of the indigenous people. And in Australia, similar things happened in many countries. To a certain extent, there is a bit of a logic in that. There are colonialists who went, ethnically cleansed completely those lands. The resistance died down, or people were forced out, or their reproduction was a lot slower than the killing that was happening to them, and therefore they died out, they fizzled out to many extents. Palestine is a different situation. Palestine is a different situation because throughout the past 75 years, you still have people who this day have the keys to the homes that they were kicked out of. You have generation after generation of Palestinians who have been born, who continue to hold steadfast to what is enshrined in international law and the United Nations charters, which is the right of return. Every refugee who has been kicked out of their home, no matter who they are, has a right to return to their home. You have a resistance that has been going on in different ways, not just armed resistance. We're talking about diplomatic, political, popular, through things like boycott.
Jamal, even though
divestments.
the International Court of Justice and the UN, they said that the settlements are illegal.
Yes.
The Israeli settlements are illegal.
Indeed, and this is something where we have an issue, right? Because you point to a very good thing, that over the past decades, you've had things like the International Criminal Court, or the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, or the United Nations Charter, or even the European Union foreign policy, or even the United States foreign policy, come out with clear statements saying that, for example, expansion of illegal settlements on the land that has been occupied post-1967, right, so the West Bank and Gaza and so forth, are illegal, okay? Now, what has happened in that time? Did Israel stop? It didn't stop. In fact, over the past 24 months alone, the increase in settlements being built, as in more Palestinian land being stolen, and having settlers move in and build. And by the way, for our audience to understand, when you build a settlement, it's not simply that you've taken that land and you've built a house there. No, you'll build an entire mini city. So it's literally like building the Pearl or Lusail, right? Not only that, what you do with that, once you've built it, all the roads leading in, okay, are reserved only for the settlers. So if you're a Palestinian now, it used to take you 5 minutes to go from one place to another. Suddenly a settlement is built, you've got to go around 2 hours because the road you used to use, you're not allowed to use it anymore. If you're a Palestinian who has a field there that used to grow, for example, olives, or used to grow any fruit, okay, so there was certain water going towards you that would irrigate that land. No, that gets diverted to the settlement. So now you're out of business. You can't, your product and your land becomes barren, okay? If you're a Palestinian, for example, and you had a school there, or for example, if you had a business there, the electricity that was going there again gets diverted. So it's not just a land grab and land theft, it also destroys or ensures everything around it. So this has happened at an immense increase over the past 24 months, coupled with the fact that you've had more Palestinian children being imprisoned, more journalists being killed. Obviously, my colleague...
Are they looking to integrate Palestinians into their own societies, or they just want to remove
Not at all,
Palestinians?
and we'll come to this point because this is the issue where we're talking about ethnic cleansing, and we're talking about also the what many human rights organizations, including even Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem, talk about apartheid and racism within. But just to finish this point here, because you're asking about October 7th, when you have all of these practices, and you have international law and organizations and countries saying, stop doing this, that's all they're saying. Nobody's really forcing them. They don't put sanctions on them like they put on some countries, right? They don't.
How strong can you be?
So at some point, there is what they call a pressure cooker. This is the logic. This is the idea at some point. Now, that pressure cooker, according, again, to international law, according to the Geneva Convention, every occupied people have a right to self-defense, right? Now, the way in which you defend yourself, you can argue about. People are legitimate, can talk about, do you purely target combatants, do you not, how do you do it, what weapons you do, that is open for discussion. What is not open for discussion, according to international law, is do you have the right to defend yourself or not? And it's also a human instinct. Now, if I come and I take your house, right, I can't now argue whether you're going to first call me, you know what, give me my house back, and I don't do that. At some point, you're going to want to take forcible action, right? Somebody might say, go to the police, go to the court, and they'll give it to you. You've gone to the police. You've gone to the court, and the court has said, Jamal should give you your house back. But it hasn't imposed it, hasn't forced me. It's just done it like that, right? Okay, at which point, what are you going to do? And your neighbors have ignored you. You know, you've gone to your neighbors, hey, by the way, in fact, not only have your neighbors ignored you, they've also said, you know what, this is the new reality, you just have to accept
Live with it. Yeah. I'll just take matters in my own hands. And
so it's a logical conclusion. The question is how do you do it, obviously, and this is the instinct, and that's why, for example, we've been very upset about what is happening, both as journalists and humans and so forth. Nobody likes to see violence. That's the instinctive nature of us as humans. We don't want to see enough violence. Nobody wants to see somebody killed, no matter who, whether they're right or wrong. It's not a nice thing to see, right? But in order to prevent that, you need to get to the source of it, and the source of it is occupation.
So that's the bottom line of the October 7 attacks.
Ultimately, that's where, and this is where no matter which way you look at it, it always comes back to the occupation. And you ask any Israeli, ultimately, they can keep talking about, or any from the government perspective and so forth. You know, October 7th was ghastly, it was this. Firstly, and this is very important for people to understand, since October 7th, there have been almost 50 October 7ths in Gaza. October 7th, if they say 1,200 Israelis were killed, okay, you've had, and so forth, look at the destruction that has happened, okay? Obviously, there is about, now we're coming close to 20,000 Palestinians being killed, of which more than 5,500 are children, right? And this is another very important fact for us to understand what is going on in the long term. Israel is one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world, okay? It is not a mistake that 5,500 people of those killed are children. This is about looking at the future. This is about trying to kill off a generation that will resist you afterwards, right? It's not a mistake that the second highest number of casualties are women as well. It's not a mistake that out of the 25,000 that have been, or more even, that have been injured, there are specific injuries that they're not light injuries that are, whether it's things that prevent, we've found out from certain reports, the use of white phosphorus and other, that prevent reproduction and so forth. So these are things that are very important. That's why, for example, terms like ethnic cleansing are being used, and genocide. Why? Because what you're ultimately doing is trying to wipe out a population. And this comes to the other question you were asking about integration or not integration, right? You go to the essence again. Firstly, it is not for an occupier to integrate you, right? By default, again, I give you the house example, and I know it's a simple one, but that is what it is. It's simple.
So in a way, I'm not going to live with you.
Yeah, and I come and I came and I took your house, right? And then I was like, you know what? Just come, man. Just come live with me. You know, you can take the toilet. You can take the small room in the back, right? And then you have an issue with it. And I tell you when you can go out and when you can go in, right? And every now and then maybe you've got some kids, I might arrest them or detain them, right? Your friends want to come and visit you. No, they can't visit you. You have to come through me. You want to pray? No, you can't pray. You pray if I tell you. If you're above 50 years old, you can pray. If you're not above 50 years old, you're not allowed to go into the prayer, which is one of the most sacred places you have. The water that I've divided, I'm only like me and one other person. I'm taking 90% of the water. You and your 7 members of your family, you can take 10%. That's literally, and then I talk about integration.
That's what's happening, basically.
That's ultimately, it's as simple as that.
Jamal, let's move to Gaza. I want to know what's happening in Gaza. How is water being sourced in Gaza, the food, the medic?
Gaza is, it's a very difficult thing to actually understand, and I say this, every day I look at, for example, Al Jazeera's reporter there, Wael Dahduh, and even we have Yumna Said for Al Jazeera English and others. And I find it very difficult to comprehend how they're able to function, really. Somebody like Wael, who his wife was killed, his kids, yet he still goes on air and talks in the most calm way, reporting on essentially, massacres that are taking place. Whilst, funnily enough, you have some mainstream American journalists who are walking in the streets and they're protected by the Israeli military, and the moment they hear a siren, they jump and make a whole Hollywood movie out of it. Like, to see the difference between truthful reporting, and not just because I work for Al Jazeera, generally, like truthful on the ground reporting, and what's sensationalism. Why am I saying this? Is because Gaza, for all the hardship that we see and the suffering, it is also inspirational, genuinely inspirational. And it makes you put into perspective your life and your problems. So they've had, for the past 45 days, water and electricity cut from them, right? We've seen videos of people drinking or collecting rainfall, right, so they can drink. We've seen people making, fires essentially from twigs and so forth because of the lack of electricity. That's not a coincidence. What did the Israeli Security Cabinet and the Minister of Defense say on October 7th, October 8th? He said, we will bomb them back to the Stone Ages. He said, we will bring hell on earth. This is purposeful. When someone says something and they do it, then I have to believe them. And it's not like the reality. And this is what's strange about Western media, is they'll be like, a hospital was bombed, and they're like, we're not sure if it was bombed, but the Israelis literally said, we will bomb it.
And I was surprised about the counting calories part.
Yeah.
When they said, we're going to give up food, but we're going to be counting the calories.
Of how it is, because what they want you to do, and what they're trying to, or what they want to get to, is they want to get you to the point of death. And there are those who they want to kill, but those who will survive, you get to the point of death, so you don't have it in you to resist. And that's the crushing purpose. I interviewed maybe last week a guy called Daniel Pipes. Okay, Daniel Pipes is a known Zionist historian and academic. He has a book that he's just released. It's called Israel Victory. Israel Victory and Palestinian Liberation. Doesn't make sense. How can you have?
They contradict.
They contradict. No, for him it doesn't. It makes sense. Why? Because he says the liberation the Palestinians need isn't liberation from Israel. It is liberation from the idea that they should be free. So the sooner they accept to be subservient to the Israelis,
they'll be free.
They'll be free. Okay,
That makes no sense.
Of course, because it goes against our human, human, Muslim and Arab identity, which is you are born free and you will stay free, and you have what we have in terms of honor and karama and so forth, right? What any occupier to be free, and it is the MO of any colonizer, is they don't want you to be free. So either they will kill you, or they will bring you to the point of starvation, so that all you care about is being able to get through the day, right? But the strange thing is, you look at Gaza now, right, and it breaks all the rules.
They're much more powerful right now.
100%. It breaks all the norms. Imagine 17 years under occupation, or under siege rather. 75 years of occupation, 17 years under a siege, land, air, and sea.
2 million.
2 million people.
What's the average age inside of Gaza?
We have half the population is children under 18. 1.2 million are children, right? And this is the next thing. By the way, bearing in mind, not only that, they have one of the highest per capita literacy rates in the world. And despite all the suffering, and this is why I'm saying it's inspirational, they still invest in themselves as humans, right? So being able to study, being able to read, being able to go to university, being able to come up with new ways of surviving despite that siege. So 17 years of siege. During those 17 years, you've had 4 wars, right? And when we call them wars, they're rampage massacres, essentially, that have taken place, right? Targeted killings, use of white phosphorus, all of these things. And despite that, you still stand firm for your right to resist. Despite that, you haven't seen mass protests out of Palestinians in Gaza saying, you know what, khalas, let's just accept this Israeli victory and let's just move on. You haven't seen that.
I've seen the footage of people in Rafah even.
Yes.
The Egyptian side basically, and they were interviewing these Palestinians who left after the closing of the border basically, and they were like, "Are you going to go back to Palestine?" And there was like an ongoing airstrike. And they were like, definitely. If they open it right now, I'm going to head back.
Yes.
So you can see how the determination of
and this is the difference between those who view themselves as the rightful owner of the lands and those who don't. What did we see on October 7th? On October 7th, you saw thousands of settlers and Israelis rushing to the airport to leave. Right? Now, if the land is yours, you don't leave it. If the land is yours, you don't bomb it, carpet bomb it, and burn it to the ground. If the land is yours, you take care of it. You plant it, you build in it, you hold tight to it. You hold firm to it. If it's not yours, the moment there's the slightest bit of trouble, you're gone.
But Jamal, you said something about the act of self-defense. You think that self-defense is a gray area, basically. So do you think the attacks of October 7, after the attacks of October 7 is self-defense?
So I think that the principle of self-defense is not a gray area. The way in which you exert self-defense is, okay, that's from one side. And then who is in the posture of self-defense shouldn't be a gray area. It's actually very clear. But with the pro-Israeli lobby working so hard over the years, for many it has become a gray area. So now we hear, as you were saying, lots of people saying Israel has the right to defend itself. Every argument before it starts, Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel, okay, we take a pause. Defends itself against who? Hamas. Okay, let's take another pause. Why is it defending itself against Hamas? They did October 7th. Okay. What happened before October 7th? When was Hamas established? Hamas was established late 80s, 87, 88. So what about before that? Who was Israel defending itself against? And why was Hamas established? Hamas wasn't established out of nowhere. Fatah was not established out of nowhere. The PFLP...
Let's go to this. I like this backtracking of Hamas and Fatah.
Mm-hmm.
Who established Fatah and who established Hamas and how did they...
So let's go. I'll tell you. We'll even go back a little bit more, right, if you don't mind, to the establishment of armed groups. Okay, and when did armed conflict happen in this land? Okay, as we said in the beginning of this, when we were talking about this, we said, Palestine existed. It was under the British mandate at the time, and the British promised this land to the Zionist movement.
Was it the one that was signed by Rothschild?
By Balfour. But part of the lobby to get the Zionist movement and so forth involved families like Rothschild and so forth, right? Now, and it was called the Balfour Declaration, right? Now, at the time, Palestine, being under the British mandate, didn't have a military, right? So it wasn't and actually very few of the Arab countries had even a semblance of a military, right? Because they were either under the protectorate of the Ottoman Caliphate, right, or the British, right? So any form of armed organization was very limited to them, right? Bearing in mind, and there's other reasons for it in the fact that actually the Arabs at the time were not, and this is proof to the fact that they're not an aggressive people going out to take over others' lands. Now, when suddenly the people of Palestine started seeing mass Jewish migration, so ships coming of loads of Jews coming to their land, and that their land was being taken away, and the British were facilitating this at the time, obviously there was protests against this. Anyone who's coming to take parts of the land is going to... The Jews, not wanting the British to be able to find a peaceful solution of some sort, and maybe worried that maybe the British turn around and reverse the Balfour Declaration and so forth, thought it was in their interest to expel the Brits as quickly as possible. Now, how do you expel an occupier? This is the funny thing. You have to resist against them, armed, or you have to attack them.
And I heard like the Jews didn't know that they are like Palestinians in the land. They thought like it's a...
This was the lie that was put to them, but the truth is, I think anybody who read, even back then, there was a very clear, Palestine is not a desert in the end of the day. It is a fertile land that has religious significance to millions of people around the world.
That was the picture that was painted for the Jews who came in.
I think that was a picture many of the Zionists painted to others to justify them coming in. So they said, as you mentioned, they said a land for a people without a land. A land without a people for a people without a land, right? So this was the lie that was there. But here, so when the decision was taken, the Zionists at the time who then arrived there decided to set up militia. So some of the first two that were set up was the Irgun and the Haganah, right?
Was it during the era of Tantura?
This was in the 30s, and 40s, right?
Okay.
Late 30s, early 40s. When they were set up at the time, and the massacre of Tantura was, I think, 47.
Around the area.
Yes. Okay. Now, but before this, who did they actually target? They targeted the British. So there was one of the worst attacks was in what was known as the King David Hotel. King David Hotel had some generals from the British at the time who were there and was attacked. Go back to the BBC archives. See how the BBC reported these attacks. They reported them as Zionist terrorists attack.
So
the
fully
British,
biased
right?
as we see right now with the
At the time,
Palestinians.
it was because at the time these were people who came, this was actually terrorism. This was Zionists who came in and attacked the British for no reason and killed indiscriminately in a hotel, right? And they carried out several other acts of terrorism, including the massacres you mentioned, Tutura, Dir Yassin, and others. So, who set up armed groups there at the time in militia? Were the Zionists. Of course, there were armed groups that were then set up, Amin al-Husseini and others who looked to do, because by khalas, now it's very clear it's a conflict, or it's becoming, I'm seeing foreigners coming to take my land as a Palestinian. The Zionists are seeing that the British are talking now about maybe partition, about maybe, kind of semi-independence for a certain thing. And there is this greed by the Zionists to take, not just, by the way, Palestine, and maybe we can talk about this later. Theirs is not from the river to the sea, theirs is from the river to the river. Greater Zionism believes that the promised land is from the river Nile to the Euphrates, right? So there is an expansionist project that is coming to be built. Now, you fast forward to 1948. 1948, the British mandate ends. They haven't solved anything, purposefully so, because the British colonialism was, whenever we rule a land, when we leave, make sure there's a conflict, because it will ensure that these places stay fighting each other and they will still need you.
Was it with the UN plan in 1948?
There was a UN suggestion that was never adopted at the time for petition. But like I say, you see how the British left, for example, India and Pakistan. You see how the British left several places. You'll see there is always a conflict there. Not just the British, to be fair. The French did the same in Africa, and the Spanish did it as well between Morocco and Algeria. And wherever you go, you will see that colonizers will always leave a conflict for that place to continue. So they left it. Israel announced what it called its independence in 1948.
What was the reason of leaving a conflict in a
The reason for colonizers to leave a conflict is because it ensures two very important things. Number one, that the people you colonized, you will still be able to control them by supporting one side against another, because they will always come back to you for weapons or for validation or for economy. It also ensures that those countries, that you will have better access for their resources, because rather than their resources being used to develop their countries, they will be used to be sell off for political favors from these superpowers.
Okay.
Right? Now, once the Israelis announced the independence, at the time, the Arab armies, or what were called Arab armies, again, they were very minuscule in ability. Even the Jordanian was under the leadership of a British general, okay, at the time. Glab Pasha was his name. And you have, obviously, the Iraqi army was limited. Egypt, through, again, was still just 48 was prior to, it was still under monarchy, which was very much influenced by the Brits and so forth, sent their armies assuming that they're going to be able to, overrun these Zionist militias. Not knowing that a lot of these Zionist militias had been trained by the RAF, the Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom, that a lot of the weaponry that the British had, they left it there. They didn't take it back. They didn't leave it for the Palestinians. They left it for the Zionists. So they were defeated. We then went into several rounds of conflict, right? So after the 1948 war, you had the 1956, you had the 1967, and you had the 1973 wars, all of which the Arabs lost, okay, for different reasons, right? Whether it's Arab regimes who weren't prepared enough, whether it was because of the military, whether it was because of US support, whether it was because of lack of unity. That's not the topic. The point was they all failed, okay? The worst of them all, obviously, was 1967, because prior to 1967, the West Bank was being controlled or administered by Jordan, and Gaza was being administered by the Egyptians. Al-Quds and Al-Aqsa was still under the hands of Arabs and Muslims. But 1967 war, the Israelis took everything. Now this, not only did they take the entirety of Palestine, they also took parts of the Golan Heights, parts of Lebanon, and parts of Egypt, all the way Sinai up until Port Said, right? Egypt then went into normalization and whatnot, and obviously they did the 1973 war and then used that as a justification to go into normalization and the Camp David treaties. Jordan stayed as Jordan and never went back to administer the West Bank, but through the Treaty of Al-Aqaba that they did, they got some sort of a deal that they would be able to be the custodians of Masjid al-Aqsa, but even still under the rule or control of
many stuff, historical stuff in Palestine are under the the custody of
Of
Jordan.
course, and
Yeah.
of course, and there's a lot that we saw with Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and many things.
We call them
at the time,
awqaf,
yeah. Yes, yes,
waqf.
yes, yeah. For this that was the situation. Now here, where does this answer? Sorry, it's a very long answer to the question about where did the armed groups come from. So when people lost faith in that the Arab armies will fight again, right? They got destroyed in 1967 war. 1973 Egypt fought but didn't fight for Palestine. It fought for Egypt, for Sinai, right? It didn't do much more after, and therefore the question became, as Palestinians, what do we do? Herein was the idea of armed resistance, right? And you had obviously many different people who started obviously from people we know in terms of Abu Nidal or Abu Ammar Yasser Arafat and so forth. There was in the Arab world generally, because Palestine is part of the Arab world, two main political
Parties.
thoughts or parties. The nationalist Nasserite Al-Qawmiyin, as we call them, right, on one hand, and the Islamist kind of Islamic-oriented trend. They were the two main ones, right? And they were everywhere, in every Arab country.
It was
right?
trending in the region.
Yes. So those, at the time post-1967, 1967 was not just a defeat for these, it was also a defeat for a big blow. I wouldn't say a defeat, but it was a big blow for the Nasserist camp. Right, because it was Abdel Nasser who was the president of Egypt at the time, and he had spoke a big game, and we're going to wipe out Israel, and we're going to go. He went into the war, and he lost even more. Right, so a lot of people lost faith in that. So usually, and again, this is not something unique to the Arab world. Everywhere around the world, when you're at the lowest point, most people go to religion, right? Because you can't see any hope, so you turn to
try
God.
to find hope in religion.
Yes, so that is where the Islamists started getting more popular as a consequence. And then different things started forming. So you still had, at the time, obviously throughout the 60s, 70s, what you had was Fatah, and you had the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. There was several different, or Black September group, and there was several different armed groups that started setting up, okay? Their objective was to resist and to fight back because...
So there were groups within the parties, like...
There were, and yes, and they would splinter up, and sometimes these groups didn't know who was with who and so forth in terms of, and it wasn't most organized, is what you can say, right? Come to the 80s, right? After a lot of these organizations that had set up at the time, then the PLO and so forth, were seen to be aligned with one political view, which is more, like I say, nationalistic, leftist, secular oriented. Not to say that they're not Muslim at all, but their identity was more from that perspective. There was a vacuum for those who identified with religion. And what I mean by identify with religion here in Palestine isn't that they view this as specifically a religious conflict between Muslim and Jews. No, but they believe that through Islamic teachings, that is how you should live your life and how you should pursue politics, right, or pursue what you're doing. So the situation, particularly in the West Bank during the 80s, was getting worse and worse, and in Gaza was getting worse and worse. That was when you started seeing the first increase in settlements being built, and you started seeing, a lot of arbitrary detentions and so forth. So at that point happened what was called the Intifada, or the first uprising, or Intifadat al-Hijara is what it was called. This is before rockets, before drones, before gliders. The Palestinians had rocks, stones, and they would throw them at Israelis, and they would be killed as a result, okay? The teachings of Hamas at the time came from a primary school teacher whose name was Ahmed Yassin. Ahmed Yassin was a wheelchair-bound primary school teacher, as I mentioned, who taught that it was only through returning to God and practicing one's religion and holding tight to religion that one can find the strength to overcome the oppressor, okay? And it was a very small organization that was founded. Obviously, there was other people from around the world. Palestinians were in diaspora. You had the biggest number of refugees around the world were Palestinians. So obviously there was people in Kuwait like Khalid Mish'al and others who then later set up what was the political wing. And then you had the Al-Qassam Brigade, which was a military wing, which was splintered off. Interestingly enough, by the way, Izz ad-Din al-Qassam, who they're named after, is not Palestinian, he's Syrian. He's a famous resistance fighter who resisted the French occupation in Syria, and the brigades were, which goes into the notion and the concept of resisting occupation regardless of.
So they all have the same story in terms
Yes.
of namings.
Yeah. For here you have, So this was the story of Hamas. And Fatah obviously was, its founding father and leader and so forth was Yasser Arafat. Where is there an issue now? Honestly, if you're looking at this from a conflict perspective, if you're looking at it to see where the solution is and where the problem is not in Palestinians having many different factions, right? Because the truth is, again, all humans, all societies have different opinions, right? Whether it's, if you follow football, you can support a football team and somebody else can support a football team. If you're into politics, you can support or vote for a political party, somebody else can vote for a political party. If you like food, and what I'm saying is diversity is in everything. The problem is not in the division here. The problem that exists, and this is one of the framings that the Israelis try to push, and even some of the kind of pro-Israeli Arab media outlets or others who try and they say, oh, the problem is the Palestinians are divided. That is not the problem. Because Palestinians being divided is not what built the apartheid separation wall. The fact that you have Fatah and Hamas is not what killed 5,500 people. It was the bombs of the Israelis. The fact that you have Fatah and Hamas is not what keeps 10,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails, amongst them 700 children, right? So the truth of it is divergent tactics in narratives is something that is common. We need to put those aside and actually look at the core of the problem. And like I said, and we'll always say, the core of the problem is occupation.
So do you think that they use the attacks of October 7 as a justification of the mass murder they've caused?
Of course, they've said this. They've said this very clearly, and we hear it, and no, the October 7th happened every time. October 7th happened. Okay, and again, like I say, by the way, and I, we've spoken to Israeli politicians and supporters, and you come back. Let October 7th, you ask the question, why is October 7th so bad? The answer is because 1,200 Israelis were killed, and it was amongst them, most of them were civilians. Okay, let's go with you. I'm going to pretend, or I will not pretend, I will go with you now and tell you this was, it's not self-defense and it's bad. Okay, by that same logic, how many October 7ths have been inflicted by the Israelis on Palestinians? Not just since October 7th. Like I say, since pre-1948. Sabra Shatila, Deir Yassin, حتى even obviously Palestine, there was Palestinians in Lebanon, but you also have Lebanese, Qana, you have the massacres that took place in Suez, in Egypt, you have massacres that took place in Syria. How many of those are, where is the logic? Why should humanity's clock start on October 7th because you were dealt a blow on October 7th? Either that's because you don't value everybody else's life, so it's only bad when it happens to you, or because you don't want to admit the fact that the source of the problem is your theft, your land theft, is your massacres, is your occupation, is your crimes. And in both those situations, I refuse that. If you're a human, you have to be consistent with what is right and what is wrong. And if you believe in freedom, you go to the source of where the issue is, and that's what you address.
Jamal, even the Western media have been accused of being biased of the Israeli war.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think this thing comes from? Is it like a hidden agenda they want to use?
I don't think it's hidden as an agenda, but it's not hidden. They don't hide it very well. What I mean here is that you have, of course, I know what you mean here. There is a clear agenda. There is a clear agenda.
It's a clear agenda, but they're not going to show you or say it to you.
They won't admit it.
Exactly.
Yes,
that's the word.
Yeah, that's it. And why am I saying, sorry, I'm just laughing at the idea of hidden. Why? Because what we have seen over the past 5 weeks, they say in Arabic, the translation of the thing is that all the masks have fallen off, right? Why? That what you have tried to hide, claiming that you are professional journalists, for example, it's all very clear. Like I say, when I see, for example, a CNN reporter on the ground, right, claiming, as if her life depends on it, when there's no danger whatsoever, right, and it makes a huge deal, right? But then I see that nobody even blinks an eyelid when Shireen Abu Akleh was shot and killed, or nobody blinks an eyelid when Wa'il al-Dahdouh's wife and son were killed because Wa'il was doing his job, or when I see nobody blinks an eyelid when Al Jazeera's offices were bombed to the ground, all of these things, then I know that you actually don't care about parity. You don't care about being objective. You just care about what you want to do. Now, why is this? Again, it goes back to the essence of what I was talking about, or at least this is my opinion. The Europeans do not want there to be large Jewish populations in their countries. And in fact, when I was speaking, I was telling you about the interview I did with Daniel Pipes. I asked him, I said, prior to 1945, where was the safest place for Jews to live? He said they were in Arab and Muslim lands, whether it was Iran, whether it was Turkey, or whether it was from Yemen to Morocco to Egypt to Iraq, right? Why? Because the Muslims did not target them. There was no Holocaust. There was no pogroms. Where did the issue come? The issue didn't come because you're Jewish. The issue came because you stole my land. You could have been atheist. You could be Hindu. You could be Muslim. And Islamically speaking, if you are a Muslim who steals another Muslim's land, then the person who has their land stolen must defend his land and push it, right? So the issue from that perspective. Now, where does the narrative come that you're talking about the media? Because they don't want them there, right? They must ensure that they support what is being described as this settler colonialist project. What is the settler colonialist project? It is a project called Israel, where you brought settlers through colonization and you put them there and you must ensure that they stay there, right? Now, in order to ensure they stay there, you need to make this narrative that they are the ones who are the victims, that they are the ones who are the rightful owners, that they are, as you said there before, there were a people without a land, so we found a land without a people and gave it to them, and so forth. This is social conditioning that went. I give you the example of how the BBC, back in the day, reported on the Zionist militia as terrorists. Now, as you mentioned, they report on Palestinian children essentially as terrorists. They report on nurses in the hospital as if they're terrorists. People trying to save lives are seen to be guilty culprits.
Even
right?
the Shifa hospital, they said the Shifa hospital has tunnels and
of course.
And we've seen the video of the RDF.
Yes,
the guy goes
they
in.
come out. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's heavily edited. And then we've heard from the former Israeli prime minister saying that we built tunnels there. When Gaza was actually physically occupied by the Israelis, they built certain things. So they know that there is something there that's got nothing to do with the Palestinians because they built something there, right? But they never showed any proof that establishes the use. Till now, and one of the things, by the way, about the narrative, which is funny, Al-Shifa Hospital, together with all of Gaza's hospitals, okay, are funded by or supported by international organizations, be it the International Red Cross and Red Cross, the United Nations, Qatar, MSF, Medicines Sans Frontiers, Indonesia. You have the Indonesian hospital. You have the Emirati hospital. You have the Hamad bin Khalifa hospital. You have all of these hospitals that are built by international organizations and groups, and you have things like the Norwegians and so forth who are there constantly, and they have been there for the past 17 years. Not a single one of these doctors, not a single one of these international organizations, not a single one of these journalists has been able to show that these hospitals were used by armed groups. Now, why is this crazy when you're asking me about Western media narrative? If all of these people have never been able to show this, if this was about any other country, the accusation would have been laughed away. But for some reason, because of the social conditioning and the dehumanization of Palestinians and the also Islamophobic undertones and the anti-Arab racism that exists in a lot of these institutions, no, we suddenly have to believe Israel. Why do you have to believe Israel? There's no proof. Yeah, but they must be telling the truth. Why must they be telling the truth? Because the other side shouts, Allahu Akbar. There's no logic.
Yeah.
There's no proof in it.
Yeah.
But the narrative and the social conditioning that has gone on for decades has really twisted things.
But Jamal, what's the future plans of bombing Gaza and moving the guys up to the south?
There's a very clear intent that is very obvious to ethnically cleanse Gaza of Palestinians. You have 2.2 million people.
Where do they go?
Well, this is the question. You heard yesterday, for example, one Israeli minister said, what we should do is we should make it so unlivable that then the world it becomes a world problem, and each country can take 20,000 people. Okay? Each country around the world can take 20,000 refugees. If you think of, divide 2 million by 20,000, then you're all right. It was basically, she was giving you a breakdown of ethnic cleansing by numbers.
No, she said ethnic cleansing. That's exactly
essentially what it is, without saying it, right? Then you have the others who said, well, Egypt should take them. Right?
I heard about the Sinai desert.
Of course, 100%. And there is, by the way, there are sources who show that there was a proposal to the Egyptians that included zeroing Egypt's debt if Egypt was to accept those Palestinians, right? For it. So there are very clear plans. These aren't just wishful thinking. Again, when you look at people's words and actions, then you know. So the Israelis said, we will clear it. And then they cleared the north, or they tried to. By the way, it's very important when we're talking about narratives, there are still a good 400,000 or 500,000 Palestinians in the north who have refused to go. And Israel doesn't want people to know about this because they are trying to massacre them as well, right? But there is still a significant amount of people in the north. So you've pushed people to the south of the valley. And then you've started telling the world, well, you know what, why don't you take these refugees? Again, it's such a bizarre narrative because if this was, again, happening anywhere else, the world wouldn't even be, they'd be like, why are you bombing? Stop it, you know what I mean? But for some reason, Palestinian lives is seen as secondary and therefore it's allowed to happen.
But funny enough, even in the West Bank, they kept saying because Hamas is positioned in Gaza, that's why we're bombing Gaza.
Yes.
But then you're attacking West Bank.
Indeed.
What was the reason of attacking West Bank?
So the reason they claim is that they are also going after terrorism, right? The truth of it, it comes down to occupation, right? If I've taken somebody's land, so long as that person is still alive, they don't only constitute a problem for me, they constitute a threat. And here actually is where October 7th is so important. October 7th for the Israeli psyche shattered an idea that has been built for 75 years. That we are the most advanced military in the region, if not one of the most advanced militaries in the world. That no one really can hurt us, right? That if we are going to be in danger, it's going to be in danger if we as Israelis, military, go beyond. So we go into somebody else's land, if a land as in like beyond where we are now. What October 7th showed was actually that a bunch of ragtag militia were able to dupe the Mossad and the Shabak and all the other intelligence services, conduct a surprise attack, essentially dismantle the Gaza brigade of the Israeli army that was positioned and was responsible for all the past 3-4 wars that have taken place in a record amount of time. Okay, so this poses, and here is where I understand the Israeli psyche, poses an existential threat. You're going to wake up and you're going to realize, wow, I'm not that safe. I can't. Now, the logical person, and if there was actual leadership in the international community beyond those, and I say this beyond, and if it wasn't just countries like Qatar that were doing this, if we had other countries doing this, you would have found a different situation. Where you have the logical response was, for example, Qatar came out and Qatar's leadership said after October 7th, understand the root cause of this. Don't lash out. The root cause is the occupation, and we must solve the occupation in order for October 7th not to happen again. Qatar was in a minority. Unfortunately, the majority, because they are controlled or at least very heavily influenced by the pro-Zionist lobby, came out and said, unleash hell, kill more people, as if that is going to solve the problem. But, yesterday we were looking at a video of one of the fathers who he was carrying his daughter who was killed.
I've seen this.
You saw that?
That's
right?
heartbreaking, yeah.
Explain to me how Elon Musk said it, basically. For every Palestinian child you kill, of every Palestinian you kill, you are creating 10 more Hamas members. And I watched that video. I said, generally, as you say, it was heartbreaking. You can't fathom it. You know what I mean?
You cannot digest it, definitely.
Now imagine you there. Imagine that is you. You want to tell me that you wouldn't take up arms afterwards? 99% of people would. If not, they would either go into depression, right, and God forbid commit suicide, right, or they're going to want to take revenge. That's just human. Dude, if we in an argument, you and I, for example, now we're sitting down, right,
yeah,
and we're in an argument, and you said, you used a bad word against me, right? The likelihood is I'm going to want to respond.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a tit for tat, basically.
It's a normal thing. Now that's just in an argument. That you've literally taken the most dear, and he described it as ya ruh al-ruh, like the soul of my soul, right? And you see the father holding her like that, right?
And by the way, that's only one
Yeah.
of the guys who filmed it, let alone the people that we've seen. And especially we shout out to the heroes, the journalists on the ground. They're doing an outstanding job even for showing us what is happening in Gaza. Even the stories you hear of how they see the bombings and how they interact even with the injured people.
It is, yeah, and the doctors who were there.
It's a different type of mentality. And Jamal, recently we've heard about the Qatar's mediation to cease fire between Palestine and Israel. Do you know the details of the mediation?
So Qatar from the very beginning has been involved, right? And Qatar has been involved for a number of reasons. And again, Qatar's involvement doesn't start on October 7th. It starts from before. The fact that Qatar has attempted many, many times to find a solution, whether it is to the constant wars by Israel on Gaza, to find a solution for Palestinian unity and hosting talks between Fatah and Hamas, whether it's to find a solution to find a viable and strong self-determination for the Palestinians. It's been there. And Qatar's position is unique when it comes to the Arab world. Why? Because Qatari diplomacy and foreign policy is built and based on two very important factors. One is pluralism, right? So Qatar speaks to everybody, all key factors, which is if you want to be a good mediator, you have to be able to speak to all things. And Qatar will speak to somebody not necessarily because it likes or supports them, or it dislikes or doesn't support them. They'll speak because I know that this person is a key player, right? And this very few people in the polarized world that we see ourselves in, we don't have that. So you look at other countries, whether it's in the region or internationally, either they're very, very pro-Israeli or they're very, very pro this or that or whatever, right? Or in any conflict, right? And they will not solve. Whereas the pluralistic approach of Qatar foreign policy has a lot of it. The other one is that it understands the Arab street, which again is, I think, very, very important, because the truth of the matter is, in our region, as much as we differ from military regimes to monarchies to sheikdoms to everything, right? The Arab population and the Arab street cannot be ignored, right? Because even if you ignore it for a year, 2 years, 10 years, as we saw back in the Arab Spring, it can have a specific reaction that, tips the scales in a way that. So understanding the Arab streets and Arab sentiment with regards to Palestine has been something that's very clear. And we saw it, for example, this time last year during the World Cup, when Palestinian flags were waved everywhere. We saw it when, back in 2008, for example, when Egypt blocked the Arab League from an emergency meeting, and the father Emir at the time, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa, organized the emergency summit here in the Sheraton and brought people. So we've seen it constantly. So as I said, it's based on two things: understanding the Arab streets and pluralism. Based on this, Qatar moved directly to try and find a way out of this. What were the main demands that the Israelis were claiming that they wanted, aside from essentially annihilating Gaza, which obviously Doha opposed? Was the idea of the release of captives. What made things a bit complicated was two things. One, something on the ground that maybe our viewers or our audience don't understand, is that on October 7th, when the border was breached and the Qassam fighters crossed over, they didn't, it's not like it's a door, they didn't close it after them.
It was breached from the east, yeah?
Yes, for the east of Gaza towards, yes. Now, they didn't close and the northeast and east. Now, they didn't close the door behind them, okay? It's not a door Now, imagine you as a population of 2.2 million who you've been trapped in this tiny piece of land, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, described as a concentration camp. Suddenly you found an empty piece of, an open space. So a lot of people also went. The fighters went and targeted the military bases.
And there are people who followed.
Some people followed. Now, some people who followed, some of them came back with cars, some of them came back with mopeds and motorbikes, and some of them, by the way, came back with individuals, as in they took captives with them.
I just have a hard time thinking about this. But don't you think a breach that big would be seen?
In theory, yes. Yes. And there are many things that you can look into and wonder, how on earth did that happen? And there are many situations.
Like the advancement of technologies that
the
army has.
The analysis that a lot of people say is that the Israelis were so concerned of focusing on advanced technologies that when you did something so basic, they couldn't understand. So, for example, they built massive steel barriers into the ground because they assumed that any attempt at infiltrating the border would be through tunnels. They didn't think that literally somebody would come with a bulldozer and go through, right? They used the Iron Dome and they used other things because you're talking about things going really high. They didn't think you're going to come on a glider that is low enough that it won't be detected. That's the argument. It could be also human error. It was a Saturday, it was a Sabbath, it was a holiday. People could have been asleep. And there's proof that a lot of them were asleep because a lot of the soldiers that were captured on video were captured still in their underwear and their pajamas. It was early in the morning. So there could also be that. Going back, when the fighters came back, there now had a mixture of captives. Soldiers, that a lot of the Qassam brigades and other armed groups that were part of it captured, and civilians who a lot of the Palestinians went and captured themselves. Again, not to justify, and I'm not going to justify it, just to understand. If you have been besieged for 17 and a half years, and in 2012 or 2008 or 2014, your daughter was killed, or your son was killed, or your father or your mother was killed by an Israeli airstrike, and suddenly you saw a hole in a fence that allowed you to go and get what you believe to be some sort of revenge by capturing somebody, most human beings will do that. That is just basic human psychology. Whether it's right or wrong is not the discussion right now. This is just to explain, so they can. Now, you suddenly have now an unannounced or unknown number of hostages or captives or whatever you want to call them that are in Gaza, okay? So where the first struggle that the Qatari mediation had was, okay, we want to release some people so that we can reduce the bombing and so forth, okay? The Palestinian factions, particularly Hamas, responded to the Qataris and said, okay, we have no problem discussing, but we actually don't know where some of these captives are. Why? Because we are not responsible for capturing all of them. There are some people who went. So you have to stop the bombing to try and find out where they are, because we know Gaza and we know the terrain, and we'll let you. This went on for a good couple of weeks, until finally the Qataris were able to secure with the Americans a 4-hour cessation of bombing in a specific area of Gaza. And this was when we, if you remember, the first few hostages that were released, the women, the elderly, okay, because during that period, Hamas were able to go and get them and then hand them to the Russians. Where we are now is that obviously we're close to 50 days of this, and international opinion, public opinion, is very clearly against Israel.
But even the hostages who are taken by Hamas,
yes,
they spoke up after. With
even how like they were treated, yes.
The video of old lady speaking up. She was
saying that she was given food by her captives, that she wasn't tortured and so forth, right? But proof that this, by the way, the story of I was saying people taking, is that she says in her story, she says in my story, I was taken on a motorbike, okay, and I was at the time the Palestinians who saw her, some people did hit her right as she was coming in, right? These were members of the public.
So she got injured
yes, but the moment she was handed over to the fighters, who are actually disciplined, who have a very clear doctrine that is based on their Islamic teachings of not to harm elderly people, of not to harm non-combatants, she says her treatment was perfect. That she was given, that these fighters cleaned the toilets for her. Imagine, yani, being a captive, and the person who's capturing you is cleaning. Where we are now, like I say, is public opinion around the world is very much against what Israel is doing. Right? From a PR perspective, it is a disaster. And for the governments supporting Israel, it is also a disaster. So you look at, for example, the approval rating of Joe Biden is terrible. It's never been worse, particularly in swing states, particularly amongst young people, right, who were very key and would be very key in an upcoming election. In the United Kingdom, similarly in France and so forth. So there is more scope for Qatar to force through some sort of negotiations more, because it is now also, before, unfortunately, these governments who were supporting Israel don't have any principles, and we saw it because they didn't care about the fact that, tens of thousands of Palestinians were being bombed. They didn't care about the hospitals or the schools or even the churches. And this is the irony of it, that you're talking about countries that identify as Christian countries and had no problem whatsoever that one of the oldest churches in the world was bombed by the Israelis. But now, because it's of their political benefit to find an end to this, there is more scope. And we saw the Foreign Minister, the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdurrahman, who I think went to met with 12, 15 different countries, right, and different officials. And this resulted in the current pause, let's call it, for a few days.
But what was after the ceasefire?
This is what the Qataris are working on. There are obviously other players who will try, but I don't think they have the same leverage. Ultimately.
But from your point of view, what do you think is going to happen?
My point of view is I think that ultimately this has to stop, okay? Because unless you're going to massacre 2.2 million people, which I hate to actually say this, but never say never, because we live in a world where the most ghastly things are happening, so you never know if that. But then I would like to hope that we don't live in a world that would allow this, right? So unless you're going to do this, it has to stop, okay? Now, how you try and show that it stops so Israel can seem like it's done some sort of a victory. That is where the challenge is. So whether that's going to be, Israel saying, you know what, we've destroyed all of Gaza now and we're going to go back and the Palestinians won't be able to do anything for the next 10 years because we've literally obliterated it. Or whether it's going to be maybe if they manage to kill one of the military fighters of Hamas or something and say, okay, we've achieved it. Or whether it's because an international conference happens and God knows. I honestly don't know, because the current situation, like I say, from an Israeli psychological perspective, they themselves don't know. They've never been attacked like this before. And you have to understand that in all the wars with Arab countries, those wars took place on Arab lands, right?
Not the opposite.
Not the opposite. And not to say that this land is theirs now, but what I'm trying to say is they didn't administer those lands, right? Now, for this to happen, and by who? Like I say, these are a bunch of people who are fighting using flip-flops and like torn Adidas tracksuits. You know what I mean? The rockets and the weapons that they're made, 12 years, 2008, the furthest a Qassam-1 rocket could go was 40 kilometers at best. Now you have rockets that can go every single part of historical Palestine. You have, these anti-tank munitions. You have these drones that they've set up and so forth. So for the Israelis, generally their psyche is in a position where they cannot think clearly. They don't know what is next. They themselves don't know what.
Are you optimistic of what's going to happen?
In the long term, yes, because I don't think injustice lives on forever. And I think freedom is always going to succeed. And ultimately, again, there is never an empire in the history of the world that has lived on forever. Okay? And I'm talking about empires. So let me look at a settler colonialist project as small as Israel. It's not going to last forever. Within the Israeli narrative themselves, there is a very clear understanding now that the future can only be a one state where everybody has equal rights.
Yeah. And I've been seeing these videos of even people from the US, people from the UK. They've been watching these videos and these free media platforms, let me put it this way, of knowing what's the story, what's the backstory behind Palestine.
There's definitely a very clear shift in the narrative on free, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Forget about the mainstream media or what's controlled. On digital media platforms, you will see a very clear reclaiming of the narrative when it comes to Palestine.
Jamal, for this episode, I would like to ask the crew if any of you guys have a question to Jamal. You can ask him right now. This is your time.
Jamal, you've covered a lot of ground, so thanks for that. Do you have a timeline in mind, or do you have an idea as to when you think this conflict is going to end? When there's going to be a resolution to...
So Jamal, this is Rami, our executive producer, Rami Allahum.
That's why he's asked, like he went for a very difficult one, where if I give a timeline and then you guys come back to me and say he didn't get it right. No, look, if we're talking about this specific, as in this current specific aggression that is taking place, I think it won't suddenly stop. I think there will be a kind of de-escalation of certain things, because I think, as I mentioned, the psyche within Israel is so hell-bent on violence right now, and you see it in the narratives, that you can't switch it off. And there is no Israel, even if Benjamin Netanyahu himself, let's imagine he was somebody who was principled. Even if he wanted to stop it, I don't think he could, because it would cost him his job and so forth. So there has to be a shift in Israeli public opinion that will allow for that, and that has to be done through fatigue and some sort of cost. Unless there's some sort of like economic collapse or something, another crisis that happens in Israel that makes people want to go. If we're talking about when will this end, as in overall the question of Palestine, I'll tell you a story. In 2010, I went to report on the Gaza flotilla. The Gaza flotilla was a group of ships that was being put together by human rights organizations, activists, and medics to break the siege on Gaza and deliver much needed aid. Okay, and I went as a journalist and I reported on it. And the Israeli army attacked us in international water. They killed 10 people on board the ship, and they arrested us all. They put us in jail for a few days in Bir al-Saba, or Bir Shiva as they call it, prison. Even though we never entered Israeli waters, not even Palestinian, we were in internationally recognized international waters. They gave us a paper. They said, you have to sign this, when they came to release us, saying that we entered Israel illegally and we would be banned for 10 years. Speaking to the soldier at the time, I said to him, listen, 10 years, you think 10 years is a long time. 10 years is a very short amount of time. And the view in which, my view of how I've looking at things, I do not believe Israel will exist as it does for longer than 15, 20 years. Why? And this isn't, and just so we can understand, exist as it does. You look at apartheid, right? You look at even French occupation. I know Rami's Algerian of Algeria, right, before. You look at British occupation of India. You look at any of these, and with all the differences that they had in terms of their governance. But ultimately, foreign powers, there is a specific life cycle to them. And how do you know that you're near the end? You often the most violent episodes that the occupier shows is actually when they're at their end.
So it's just they go all out.
That's it. Because it's all or nothing.
So Jamal, you have first-hand experience with the Palestinians and Israelis. Do you remember any memorable story or?
I have, of course. There's a few. I mean, for me, by the way, one of the things to share with you, I wasn't actually planning to be a journalist. Okay, I studied economics and Arabic in London, and then I worked in politics. Actually,
I had the same thing.
And then I worked in, so there's a lot in common. I worked in politics. I became a journalist almost by accident. When Al Jazeera English came to set up, I was here for a conference. They invited me, and anyway, we went there. But one of the things that convinced me to be a journalist actually was Palestine. Was for me that I felt the narrative about Palestine was so skewed and was so twisted in the English-speaking media world that I felt there was a need to be a journalist in order to
You're obligated.
rectify that. Yes, right. So the first ever time I went as a journalist was in 2008 to cover the 60th, I believe at the time, anniversary of the Nakba. I remember I went to the Qalandia refugee camp to do a report. I was a producer at the time. I was working for Al Jazeera, and we were with a reporter called Noor Ode. We went there, and then we went to Jenin. Okay, and obviously the stories at the time, you're hearing from people who have, their husband's been in jail for 20 years, or their son's been in jail for this long, or somebody who's had their house destroyed because a relative said something or did something or whatever. Constant situations. What was inspiring, and what has always been inspiring, was two things. One was and I know as Arabs we're very used to hospitality, but there is a different type of hospitality. And I can be hospitable when I'm comfortable, right? And nothing's wrong with me. And when I go out of my way to be hospitable, when I'm actually the one who...
In need.
Yeah, right? And I don't mean this in need in terms of looking up, down. No, as in you are occupied, your land is taken away from you, like I say, water resources, electricity, and so forth. Yet despite that, the hospitality that you have is something that is different, right? And this is where I think it's so important for Arabs to understand, because part of the Zionist project has been to try and detach Palestine from its Arab surrounding and from its Arab identity, right? Which is something else. The other inspiring thing was the children, generally. You understand through Palestinian children that a lot of the lies that were said over, that Palestinians sold their land, that's why it is, right? Or Palestinians are traitors. No, Palestinians from a young age understand very clearly that their identity is linked to resistance. Just being alive is a form of resistance for them. Identifying as a Palestinian is a form of resistance because people don't want you to identify. Identifying that you are from this specific village or from this specific city is a form of resistance. Why? Because it's a continuation of a memory that cannot be lost in order to ensure...
Even keeping the house key. I know some people who kept the house key.
Yes.
Till today.
Yes. And that in and of itself, as you mentioned, that is that symbol of it. So those are things that I think obviously one of the other things that I generally, again, just very briefly to mention, and I think it's always important to do is, on that trip was the first trip I met Shireen Abu Akleh, who was our correspondent who was assassinated by the Israelis a year ago. And I'll tell you something interesting about that, was that, again, you learn, I worked so I had been working for Al Jazeera 2 years up until then, and I was working with journalists who were ex-BBC, CNN, Fox, and many different ITN and so forth, who have many, many years of experience, right? But what I saw through specifically Shireen was the first where I actually felt it tangibly. The difference between a journalist who is doing it just simply to tick a box, or a journalist who is doing the job sometimes because journalists like to be famous on camera, blah, 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 and so forth, and a journalist who actually believes in the message of journalism. And what is that? Is that for the people to have a right to know, to be informed, for you as a journalist to have the responsibility to ensure that you have been entrusted, you have been given an amana by people. This is my story, go and tell it, right? And I saw it through her in a way that for me was very eye-opening at the time.
These were like
Some
the changes
things, yes.
that made Jamal get into journalism.
Yeah, you can say.
Jamal, it was a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And guys, thank you for joining us on this podcast. And please, if you have any questions, type them below in the comments. And don't forget to follow us on our social media handles. And we'll see you at the next episode. Thank you.